Good morning, Phoenix, and welcome to the House of Mystery radio show. This is the place to come for true crime, conspiracy, and alternative history. Only on KFNX 1100 Independent Talk Radio. We're here every Saturday morning, 6 to 7 a.m., and I'm your host, Al Warren. We're back in the House of Mystery, and joining us today we have an author, Geoff Holder, who's written over 30 books, and some of them were really caught my eye, and I know my listeners just love this. And today we're going to be focusing on creatures found in Scottish myth and Scottish reality. We're going to kind of cover what's real and what's not. And thank you for joining us on the show, Geoff.
It's a pleasure.
So, I didn't realize there were so many creatures, as we would say, in Scottish folklore. And I don't know why, but just looking it up, getting ready for the show, wow, there's just a list. And where does that all come from?
You're asking me the impossible question there, aren't you?
Well, like, why?
Despite my advanced age, I wasn't actually around in the Dark Ages.
Well, being on your website, I see that you're raised by wolves. I thought maybe you'd be...
that may not be entirely true. You have to bear in mind that writers always bend the truth a little bit.
Yeah. Well, okay. Now, the most popular, of course, there's the water horse that I've heard about, and Loch Ness, of course. So, where did you want to start here? Like the water horse, sort of?
Yeah, I'd like to commence with the water horse, because that is sort of the beast. The entity, if you like, that sort of is the preamble to the Loch Ness monster. So I can start with that if you like.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Sure. Okay. So how did we first get to a water horse? Like where was it first spotted?
Right. Well, the water horse is a uniquely Gallic monster. In fact, it's a demon. It's a demonic demon that's found extensively in Scottish folklore, principally on the west coast of Scotland, but also in inland lochs as well. And the phrase water horse is a translation from the Gaelic original. And apologies to any Scottish Gaelic speakers who are listening about my pronunciation, but I think it's pronounced something like Ichwiska is the Gaelic name and that translates as water horse. And the water horses, although there are many stories about them, they basically come down into two forms. The first is a beautiful horse that is encountered on the shores of the sea or a loch by a group of children. And the children think it's so wonderful that they have to get on the back of the horse and ride it. And there's always one child who says, no, that's a water horse, you can't do that. And the others ignore him. And once they're on the horse's back, it plunges into the water, drowns the children, and consumes their bodies.
Oh.
And the second version is that a beautiful maiden from a coastal village meets a very attractive, very handsome young man, and they walk along the beach together. They have a very pleasant time, and as they're sort of holding hands, and his head is on her shoulder, she notices that in his hair there's sand or seaweed or starfish. And this is the clue that he is a water horse. But if she ignores these signs and she kisses him, he turns into an actual horse and then takes her under the water and drowns her and consumes her. And the sign that a water horse has been active in your area is that the lungs and hearts of the victims float to the surface. For some reason, water horses cannot digest lungs and hearts, so they leave those behind and they float to the surface.
Oh. Now, is this still going on today? Like, are people still seeing the water horse?
No. It's now being consigned to the past of folklore. People, the water horse sometimes comes up, but now it's like so much of folklore. It's been defanged. It's been denatured. You know, it's now just a story for children. It's now just about a beautiful horse, and it's mythical and wonderful and lovely, and it's all for children. And all the stuff about, you know, eating people and, you know, drowning, all that has been departed. So it was certainly in place in some remote parts of Scotland. Belief in the water horse persisted into probably the very early 20th century, but that has disappeared now. So
do they believe that the water horse has become, like, just died off or extinct?
No, it's just that it's a folkloric demonic being that is too vicious and unpleasant for our anodyne contemporary thinking. You know, we don't like our monsters of folklore to be nasty, because folklore is just for children now, isn't it? You know, I mean, personally, I like my folklore read in tooth and claw, and, you know, the water horse is very much a red in tooth and claw kind of monster, but it, you know, that monstrous part of it has just leached away.
Well, that's incredible. And so, what was the purpose of the water horse, do you think?
Well, I think it's probably evident to most people listening to those stories that they're warnings about the water. You know, that they're an embodiment of the dangers of the water. Don't go too near the edge of the loch. Don't go too near the edge of the sea. And they're these kind of children's bogies exist in maritime and coastal locations and cultures throughout the world. So I think that's probably what it's about. The thing about the beautiful maiden meeting the handsome youth, I think there's an evident warning in there as well.
Wow, that's and how did we get into the Loch Ness?
Well, there's a newspaper report from 1852, and a group of people who were working on the side of Loch Ness, they were agricultural workers, saw two strange animals swimming across Loch Ness. Now, they didn't quite know what it was or what they were, but they got a little bit frightened, and they sort of started to pick up their agricultural tools as defense, you know, their rakes and their pitchforks. And then one of them said, oh, actually, it's a pair of deer. And because they're in the loch, it'll be legal to kill them. So he went and got his gun to shoot the deer, and he's about to fire when he saw what they thought they were, and he threw it down and shouted in Gaelic, "God protect us, they are the water horses." Now, and they kind of all panicked. So what that showed was, in 1852, in what was then a very remote part of Scotland, some of the local people still believed in this demonic being, this creature of the water horse, and they were frightened by it. As it happened, the creatures actually were real horses, a couple of ponies that had escaped from an estate about a mile away. So, you know, they weren't threatening at all. But possibly for, you know, maybe a minute or so, those people on the shore were frightened by the fact that they were real water horses. So that's from Loch Ness, and that's the sort of, you know, that's the sort of kind of link we've got in the mid-19th century at Loch Ness and in other parts of Scotland. We have people believing in something monstrous in the loch.
What do you think it was that they thought was so monstrous?
Well, it's just that it's the general belief in the water horse. The traditional water horse is very dangerous, and I've got another example of that. This is from just a few years later. It's from the island of Skye. It's from the year 1870. It's from a very small loch called Loch Ness, and it's about the size of a football field, this loch. And that year, the two local people were cutting rushes at the edge of the loch, and they saw something on the shore. And initially, they thought it might have been a drowned cow, but then it swam out into the loch with its head below the water and performed some sort of strange activities. And immediately, the pair were so terrified. They thought, it's the water horse. They just ran away, and they went to the local authority figure, who was the factor, the man who sort of managed the estate. And he clearly believed them, because what happened probably the next day was that an organized water horse hunt took place at this loch, with dozens of people from the local area turning up with two small boats, one placed at either end of the loch, and a large net unraveled between the two boats, and they just trawled the entire loch from end to end, with dozens of the local people looking on. And about halfway through the loch, the net got stuck, and this sort of fear just rippled through all the crowds that maybe it got stuck on the water horse, maybe they really had actually trapped the monster. Then the net came away, and they just carried on. And at the end of the process, when they'd finished trawling the loch, all they came up with was two small fish and a bunch of mud. But the fact is, these people genuinely believed there was something like the water horse in this tiny loch, and they had gone to great lengths to try and trap it. And that to my mind is the first example I know of an organised monster hunt in Scotland.
And so it just kept progressing, I guess. I just noticed, because in a lot of countries around the world, there's some sort of sea monster or creature in their big lakes.
Yes.
So it's contagious, I guess, or something.
I don't know whether you've ever had this experience, but it's certainly easily experienced at Loch Ness. Loch Ness is a very large loch. It's very long, and it's frequently misty, foggy, raining there. And I've been out in a small boat in the centre of the loch, and you can't see the shore because the weather's so awful. And the loch is very, very dark. It's very peaty, so you can't see into the water. You can't even see an inch into the water, and you feel really insignificant. You feel like you're cast adrift in hostile, dangerous nature, and water that you can't see into, you tend to populate that with dread, I think. There's a sense of dread that comes out from not being able to look into water, not be able to see land, and you wonder what's there. I suspect that experience is commonplace throughout the world.
And so now, are we still seeing Loch Ness now?
Well, people claim to do so. I'll be quite frank. I'm a little skeptical, and the reason for this is that if the Loch Ness monster is a flesh and blood monster, then it has to eat. Also, it can't be the same monster that's been going around for decades and decades, so it has to have been a breeding colony as well. So, large creatures need to eat. Loch Ness is what's called a very low nutrient environment. It's very deep, it's very cold, there's not much in the way of nutrients being washed into it from the surrounding topography. And so nothing large lives in Loch Ness. There's no large fish in Loch Ness at all. There's no nutrients, there's nothing for a large creature to eat. So if there is such a thing as the Loch Ness monster, it cannot be a permanent resident. It can only be, at best, something that comes into the loch from the sea. The loch is open to the sea by river and by canal at both ends. And we know that some large creatures can come into the Loch Ness because seals have been seen in the loch, and seals are exclusively saltwater animals. So they've come in from the sea for just a day or two at a time. So we know some large animals can do that. So if there is a Loch Ness monster, then it's only a visitor to Loch Ness, not a permanent resident.
So he comes from another country, probably.
Papers are important.
Blame it on the English. So, and not only that, I guess nowadays everybody's got camera phones and pictures. Couldn't we get a good picture of it now?
You'd think, but I'm going to take you back through the mists of time. There are a number of very local sightings of something in Loch Ness throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But the key year, and it's relevant to your question here, is 1933, because in that year a new road was built alongside the loch. Prior to that, it was very difficult to actually get along Loch Ness, but now there was a metalled road, so anyone with a motor vehicle could drive along, and strangely enough, that's when the sightings increase. And what you have is that year, 1833, when the local newspapers talk about the sighting of a monster fish in the loch. Words, monster fish, okay? And that sighting was taken up by a newspaper in Glasgow and then by newspapers in London, by which point the word fish had vanished. So it was just a monster. So initially it was a monster fish in Loch Ness, becomes a monster in Loch Ness, becomes a Loch Ness monster. That all happened in the year 1933. And that same year you have this explosion of reported sightings. What happened? Well, what happened is that the London papers and papers from elsewhere sent correspondence up to Loch Ness, which at the time must have felt like going to the end of the world, especially if you were especially from London. And once they got to this end of the world place, they had to find a story. Well, how do you find a story? And particularly in a community which is quite insular and suspicious of fancy people from London. Well, what you do, you buy them drinks. You go into a pub and says, "Who's got a story about the Loch Ness Monster?" I'll buy a drink for anyone who's got a story about the Loch Ness Monster. Aha! So suddenly you have this explosion of sightings, supposedly going back many decades, from people who I suspect might have been bought drinks by London journalists. Now, the problem with this now is that some of those sightings may have been genuine, but some of them may have been elaborated for the getting of extra drinks. And then you get the famous photograph. You will have all seen this photograph that supposedly looks like a long neck with a small head, very grainy black and white.
Right, yes.
That when that was taken, known as the surgeon's photograph, when that was taken, it just, to use a modern term, went viral. It went around the world. Suddenly you didn't just have a story about a monster, you had a photograph of the monster. And at the same time, people started seeing things that looked like that photograph. Right? Yeah. And then the word plesiosaur gets used in 1933 for the first time in a newspaper account of what somebody saw. Something else is relevant here. At least two of the witnesses in that miracle year of 1933-1934 had recently seen the film King Kong, which features animated dinosaurs. So all of this comes together and it creates the image of what the Loch Ness Monster looks like. Now, I have to tell you that that famous photograph is a fake. It is a toy submarine with some plasticine on it.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was deliberately made as a fake. And many of the photographs that followed it were deliberate fakes. One of the famous photographs of the humps of the supposed plesiosaur or other prehistoric reptile are in fact a bunch of tires. So people were faking very, very early on. So the Loch Ness Monster was like a media creation at the time. And as a consequence, everything after 1933 is in a way tainted by our expectations. People go to Loch Ness and they expect to see the monster, and they expect that the monster will look like a prehistoric marine creature. Well, that's something like a plesiosaur or something like that. And I'll give you an example of just how expectation works when people go to Loch Ness. There's a big lay-by on the road, a parking area on the road right next to the loch, and so all the tour buses stop because it's got one of the best views of the loch. And from a tour bus, you stop there, you get out, and you look at the loch, and people make jokes. Oh, is that the monster? Is that the monster? Anyway, the BBC decided to do an experiment a few years ago, what they did, they set up a TV crew at this parking area, and they pretended they were making a documentary about Loch Ness. But what they'd done, they'd hidden a telegraph pole under the water of Loch Ness, and it was attached to a big wire. And when they had enough tour buses turned up at this parking area and people were looking at the nest, they pulled the wire, and for a brief second, a telegraph pole leapt out of the water and then went back down again. Now the BBC crew acted all innocent. Oh my God, that's amazing! Did you all see that? And people were over the moon that they'd seen the Loch Ness monster. So the BBC crew said, "I tell you what we'll do. We'll interview you, and you can describe what you saw." Now remember, what they'd seen physically was an unadorned telegraph pole for a brief second. What did they describe? A plesiosaur. Fangs and claws and teeth and small head and long neck. They described what they thought the Loch Ness monster looked like. But what they'd seen was a telegraph pole. And that's how expectation now inflects everyone's experience of Loch Ness.
Wow. Quite an influence on people.
Yes, indeed so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even for myself, growing up in Canada years ago, I didn't realize that picture of Loch Ness was a fake. And we even had our own sea monster.
Yes, what was the sea monster? What was his name?
Ogopogo.
Ogopogo, of course, the famous Canadian monster. Yes.
Yeah, it's in our big lake, Okanagan Lake, which is.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's really deep and it's 70 miles long, big lake, and it's still being seen today. They're still putting photos of it on Facebook and things. People seeing waves moving and taking a picture and. Every little movement, but that influenced our monster here, because even on our milk cartons back in the day when we had milk cartons.
Don't you wish you still had those milk cartons?
Actually, yeah. And there's
and
they took pictures. They had a picture of the Ogopogo, which was really Loch Ness, on all of our milk cartons. I mean, it was like on our milk cartons. So no matter where you were, you just assumed this was real. Like we had this monster.
That's right. Yeah, you mentioned about waves in the lake there. One of the great side effects of the interest in the Loch Ness monster is that Loch Ness, as a geographical subject, has been studied extensively, and we now know an awful lot about the way water works in Loch Ness and how the way water can affect people's perceptions. So, for example, there were quite a lot of boats going up and down Loch Ness. But the way their wakes move is that they bounce off the side. Loch Ness is relatively narrow, but very long. And they bounce off the sides and then they come back into the middle of the loch and they cross over and they form these big sort of churning wakes. And the boat has long passed. So when people see that, they go, it's the monster, because there's nothing else around. It's just these sort of, but that's physics. We've also learned that there's something called I think it's called a seiche, which is an underwater wave. Now, Loch Ness has several. Every now and then, it'll have one of these underwater waves. This swell of water that is entirely, it's a physical phenomenon, but it makes things appear on the surface of the water that people misinterpret as the monster, and they go, well, it must be the monster because there's no wind. But these underwater waves don't need wind to be created.
That's just, and so people are still seeing Loch Ness now, aren't they?
Oh gosh, yeah. It's
even though that was fake. I mean, the pictures, and we know
it doesn't matter. People want to believe. I mean, who wouldn't want to see the Loch Ness monster? I'd love to see the Loch Ness monster. I don't actually think it exists, but I'd love to see it if it was, if it was really real, or whatever it is that. And it's sort of like you want to sort of touch the marvelous. You want to participate in the wondrous, and the Loch Ness monster sort of represents that for a lot of people. Unfortunately, I mean, from 1930s onwards, we've had a whole series of photographic fakes, as well as a whole series of misinterpretations of what was there. These days, with camera phones and easily accessible, editing technology, the number of fakes is just, rocketing. Just go onto YouTube, you see so many fakes of the Loch Ness monster. It's getting a bit depressing now.
Well, people are getting so good at doing that sort of thing.
That's right. Yes, and it's now. In the old days, you could study photographs and go, well, that might be, this wave phenomenon, or that might be a log. But these days, it's almost it's like the default has to be this must be a fake. Even if the real Loch Ness monster turned up until someone took a photograph of it, most of us would go, well, that's probably a fake, because we're so used to there's so many other things that are fake. I'll just give you another example of how this can work. When I was writing my book on Loch Ness, I walked around the entire loch, and at one point I managed to get very close to the water, and there were a series of sticks floating in the water. And what I did, I deliberately took photographs of them, cutting out the horizon, so you couldn't see the horizon. All you saw was these vertical things and the water. And because there are waves in Loch Ness, the water level was varying a bit. I took about 24 photographs. And I was staying at the youth hostel, and that night I showed everyone else there this sort of chain of photographs that I'd taken. I didn't give them any comment. I said, look at this. Look at what I photographed today. And people going, whoa, it's the monster. No, it's a stick. But because it was in Loch Ness, and there was no horizon and there was no perspective, they couldn't tell how large it was, and just the assumption is that it was some kind of paranormal phenomenon, when in fact it was just me taking photographs of a stick.
Boy.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's just kind of one of those, it's hard to give up, after so many years.
It is indeed. Yeah.
Like even now, I mean, over in Canada, they've got the $2 million reward for evidence finding the Ogopogo.
What would they count as evidence?
That's I've never inquired.
I think in a way this is a really sort of bad thing, because if evidence is a corpse of Ogopogo, that's I really don't want to sort of people blasting away at rare aquatic creatures like Ogopogo. Yeah.
Yeah, it's craziness, and so Loch Ness continues. What was the thing you were talking about? The exorcism of Loch Ness.
Oh right, yes. Now, for decades, the assumption had been that the Loch Ness monster was a flesh and blood creature, and by the time you get to the sort of the late 1960s, the people who were looking for the monster, they kind of changed a bit. Let's be frank, they were hippies, okay, and they sort of started to contemplate or consider alternative explanations, that the Loch Ness monster was some kind of dimension hopping sort of an entity like that. It was sort of magical as a thing from physical, and as a sort of extension of this, the idea came about that Loch Ness monster was actually evil, that it was some kind of demon, and this was springboarded from an event that took place in Sweden, where a number of people were interviewed that they'd seen a monster in Lake Storsten in Sweden, and they'd all suffered, or they said they'd suffered a very negative mental effects as a consequence. So this idea came about that these Loch monsters were perhaps demonic, and it was now 1973. Eccentric clergy could now become sort of part of the scene, and we get two Protestant exorcists from the Anglican Church, accompanied by a writer on the paranormal, and they decide what they're going to do is exorcise the Loch Ness monster. As you do. So now, and it's obviously quite a challenge to exercise something like the Loch Ness monster, but so they came up with a plan. They took a map of Loch Ness and they drew a cross over the loch, and wherever the arms of that cross met the land, they drove to each of those four places, and they commenced a preliminary exorcism. And I have some of the words of that, if you'd like me to read that for you.
Sure, this is just too good.
Okay, this is the preliminary exorcism of the Loch Ness Monster. What has been seen and is still visible to some on occasion is not a concrete present-day monster, but a projection into our day and age of something which had its habitat in Loch Ness and the surroundings millions of years ago. And he says, grant that by the power entrusted to thy unworthy servant, this highland loch and the land adjoining it may be delivered from all evil spirits, all vain imaginations, projections and phantasms, and all deceits of the evil one. O Lord, subject them to thy servant's commands, that at his bidding they will harm neither man nor beast, but depart the place appointed them, there to remain forever. So they repeat that 4 times, and then they got into a small rowing boat and rowed out into the middle of the loch, where roughly at the centre of the imaginary cross that they've drawn on the map, and they performed the final exorcism using these words. I adjure thee, thou ancient serpent, by the judge of the quick and the dead, by him who made thee and the world, that thou cloak thyself no more in manifestations of prehistoric demons, which henceforth shall bring no sorrow to the children of men. So there you go. The Loch Ness Monster was a demon in the manifesting as a prehistoric creature, and it was exorcised in 1973. Shazam!
And did it stick its head out and twist it around?
Well, this sadly wasn't a horror movie, so there was no immediate reaction. If it was demonic, it wasn't shown its face. Now, that being said, the 3 participants did all report that in the days following they experienced some sort of unpleasant paranormal experiences, but none of them were anyway linked visually or phenomenologically with the actual Loch Ness Monster itself. Perhaps if, as I've mentioned, the monster isn't a permanent resident, perhaps it just wasn't there that day.
Yeah, and they might have just had some bad food when they were traveling.
Yeah, sorry. But so there you go. So that's and the great thing about it is that the BBC, the local BBC news team, got they got wind of this exorcism, and they said to the team, "Listen, can you do it again so we can film you?" So the next day they went off into Loch with a camera crew, and they repeated some of those words again and took some photographs. But they didn't go through the entire sort of activity. But I just love the idea. So, can you do it again? Yeah, okay, we can do it again. Yeah.
Do it again. So do you think that they really believed they were exorcising this Loch Ness, or do you think they were doing it for PR?
No, I think they really believed it.
Wow.
One of the exorcists had a reputation for exorcising circus big tops and wild animal cages. Apparently, I don't know this for certain, but apparently many circus people are quite superstitious, and they found in this particular exorcist a sympathetic soul who would help them get rid of any sort of lingering unpleasantness in the sort of circuses. And so, but the amount of effort that went into this, and the apparent physical consequences, the principal exorcist almost collapsed after doing so as a result of the exertions. I can't imagine them doing that for a bit of a laugh. It didn't gain them in any way. Didn't gain them anything in any way. I think they genuinely believed it.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, and too in the 70s, with the movies, everything exorcism and Damien and all those different movies that were out. It was a very exorcist time.
Yes, indeed. So yes. But all the participants in the exorcism have passed away since, so we can't ask them now. But everything that I've read about it at the time did seem to suggest they were taking it very seriously.
Yeah. Well, sounds like it. It just every exorcism I've seen, I thought they had to have the body tied down on the bed.
Well, yeah, I know, but tell me, are you going to go and tie up Nessie?
No, but no. But I think what I'm thinking is that You're right. How do they know that it was even in
Yes.
the loch? How do they know? It's not like they saw it there and then they started doing it, or they were waiting for it. They just took a chance, and it just seems it's rolling the dice.
Yeah, that's right. But they did their best, and either Nessie was exorcised or it wasn't. I can't tell. Maybe it was banished. Maybe it wasn't.
Oh yeah, who knows? And now the other and there's another one I wanted to touch off was the fairy, the Scottish fairy.
Yeah.
Now you had a shape-shifting one, and there was quite a few different fairies. Now that's not so popular in North America. What is the concept behind a fairy?
Good question. What I can tell you is a few things that have changed. Firstly, when almost certainly right now, your listeners, that when you say the word fairy, they're picturing something like Tinkerbell. A petite, cute, wings, that sort of thing. That view of fairies is a creation of the Victorian era. Because what happened was that during the Victorian era, stories about fairies got changed into fairy stories. And fairy stories are only suitable for children, and they are once again they are defanged as well. They are fairy stories are kind of cute, Yeah. Whereas if we were living 400 years ago and we were living in Scotland, I can assure you we would be terrified of fairies. Not as in here's another ghost story to tell around the fire, but something as if you believed that there was a fairy path, and certainly you would avoid that path. If you believed that the fairies were moving between one of their forts and another, you would avoid that route. You would avoid that day, because fairies weren't cute. They were not nice. They were not simpering little Tinkerbells. They were terrifying. They were malign. They were mercurial. They could harm you as well, just as easily as help you. The great thing about 16th and 17th century stories of fairies is that the fairies sound like aliens. They don't sound like, they're not humans. They don't have human emotions. They just seem to regard the humans they come across as subjects for experiment. Sometimes they might benefit those humans, and sometimes they might do them ill. And that we have a lot of literature, a lot of written works about fairy belief in 16th and 17th century Scotland. And people in the countryside really were genuinely frightened of them.
Well, where did they come from then? Like, what were they there to? Why were they there for us?
Well, one of the notions that sort of encrusted in what you just said is that we created the fairies as folkloric creatures. And one point of view is that the fairies were there before we believed in them. That is to say, that they are some kind of indigenous magical entity. I honestly have no idea. But what are they for? Well, people are frightened of nature, particularly in fairly wild places like Scotland, and where there are dangerous things in the forests. There are dangerous things on the cliffs and dangerous things in the mountains. There are dangerous things at sea and on the coast. And maybe fairies originally are personifications of these dangers. I think there is something here. One of the many things that fairies do in the old stories is they give people unpleasant conditions. Sometimes they'll give you a hunchback. Sometimes they'll blind you in one eye. Sometimes they'll take away one of your senses. Sometimes they'll take your child and leave a piece of wood in its stead that you believe is your child. So all of these things, sudden illness, injury, early child death, these are terrible things. And fairies, being the creatures who perform these things, there's perhaps a way of explaining how these awful things happen to people for no obvious reason. And
so how did they appear to people? So that you said they weren't like the little lady with the fairy and like the wings and the little
No.
wand. So
Most fairies, if you could see them, this is the thing about fairies, is that often they were invisible. But most fairies appeared as variations on humans. Some of them were like short humans, about the size of a child. Others could be as tall as a big man, but much thinner. Some of them had very long arms or fingers. But they were basically anthropomorphic, and they tended to dress something in a similar way to the people of the place and time. So people in rural Scotland saw fairies dressed in the way that people in rural Scotland dressed, whereas people in Siberia saw fairies dressed in Siberian clothes. But generally they were sort of anthropomorphic rather than cute, and they were often of quite a size.
And so now, are we still reporting sights of fairies now?
Oh, no, that is a really good question. It's actually something that really interests me. And the reason is that fairies are incredibly unfashionable. You go into any kind of, group who's interested in paranormal and the weird, and you say, hey, I believe in UFOs. And people go, there's something there, yeah. And you can say, I believe in ghosts. Yeah, I think that might be right, yeah. And if you say, I believe in fairies, they'll just snicker. They'll laugh at you. And the reason they will laugh at you is because of the Tinkerbell factor. Because of all those things that happened in the 19th century, when we changed the fairies, the terrifying fairies of the countryside, to the comforting fairies of the fireside and the children's tale, people now think fairies are funny. Any joke about them, any mention about them is a joke. So people see aliens, people see UFOs, people see ghosts all the time, and nobody, within the sort of community, nobody will mock them. If you see fairies, people will mock you. That's what makes them interesting to me, because people are still seeing fairies. I've spoken to several people who claim they've seen something like a fairy or a gnome or something like that, usually glimpsed out of the corner of their eye when they were driving at night. But also I've spoken to a woman who lived on the Isle of Arran on the west coast of Scotland, and she and her partner regularly saw not anthropomorphic beings, but sort of things that were made of sticks, or things that were made of jags of light, or things that lived in the forests, and that she interpreted as fairies. And initially she thought it was wonderful, but in the end she and her partner got so frightened by them they ended up leaving the island. This is not, I hate using these terms, but this was not someone who was uneducated. This was a very modern woman, and she'd just been genuinely frightened by these things. So mostly, now people will tell me, because I'm the kind of writer that I am, people tell me their ghost stories, people tell me their UFO sightings. They reluctantly tell me their fairy stories, but those to me are the most interesting. I've probably spoken to about 6 people in Scotland who thought they saw something like a fairy. And they're really shy about saying it, because everyone just laughs about it. I'm the one person who's not going to laugh, because I think, well, if people are seeing things that are not fashionable, there may be something there.
Well, and recently, on HBO, on their series True Blood, I don't know if you've seen it, but
yes, I have.
Vampires, because she was a fairy.
Yep, that's right.
But they kind of made them nice.
Sort of nice.
Yeah.
One of the things that fairies, certainly in the old tales, are good at is the glamour. And this is particularly if someone was abducted by the fairies. They were often abducting handsome young men or midwives to meet their needs in fairyland. And the people who were abducted thought they were encountering and interacting with very handsome male fairies and very beautiful female fairies in palaces, beautifully adorned places. But once the glamour wore off, they saw that what they were really interacting with was a hag in a cave. But the glamour had been put on them. And fairies, certainly in the old stories, and I think to an extent in places like True Blood, that sort of idea that they project the best about, and so we imagine them more beautiful perhaps than they are. They kind of make the fairies nice, and full-size humans. But if the true blood fairies had met a bunch of 16th century Scottish fairies, I know who would win in a fight.
Yeah. So are you having problems finding out things about fairies now? Because you're saying people don't talk to you about them.
Well, it's simply that the sightings are very rare. For 100 UFO sightings, you'll get one fairy sighting. It's as simple as that. And there's also there's a few books published that, in my view, tend to be a little bit sort of kind of new agey. I'm cracking my teeth just using that term, but these are sightings of cute fairies who are there to help you with your life problems and be inspirational. I'm going, read some 16th century stories of fairies. You really wouldn't want them to invite them into your life to sort out your problems. But maybe they changed. Maybe all the fairies of the world have reformed. Now they're all nice.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I mean, even the big show in the 60s with Disney.
Yeah.
Walt Disney, on all of the TV shows, they had the fairy come out at the beginning, and they were very, very good. Yes,
that's right. Yeah. But I mean, just to reiterate that the vast corpus of literature that's written down in the 16th and 17th century about fairy belief is that the fairies are just nasty. They will blind you just for fun. They will steal your children. They commit murder, child abduction, sexual assault, theft, arson. This is what fairies do, but they don't seem to have a moral compass. They're not doing evil because they don't seem to have a sense of good and evil. They're just doing, because they can sometimes, as almost as if they're experimenting on us. And that's why, again and again, you find parallels between these very old stories of encounters with fairies and these very modern stories of encounters with beings from other planets. Alien. Fairies just seem alien to me.
Well, I wonder what their purpose was, but I mean, because when you say that they would just blind your left eye, let's say, or take your kids and stuff, were they trying to punish us?
No, that whole notion of punishing is a human idea. They seem to be other. They seem to be other. They're like it's like trying to communicate with. I'm trying to think. Trying to communicate with a spider.
Yeah.
A dangerous lizard or snake. Here we go. The snake doesn't think, I will punish this human by biting them. The snake just thinks, I will bite. Well, if it thinks at all, But there is something. Snakes and other creatures they're other. They are alien. They're definitely not human. We don't look into their eyes and sense a kind of that there is a thinking, feeling being in there in the way that we do when we look in the eyes of, say, elephants or dogs or dolphins. We can sense sentience there, but when you look into a snake, it just seems other. And if you get to the early stories of the fairies, that's what they seem to be, other.
What got you into all this research, like all these books on paranormal and zombies and witchcraft and the creatures?
Going back through the mists of time. I am all about overcompensating. That's my life. It's all about overcompensation. I grew up in a house without any books. But when I was 7, somebody gave me a book on dinosaurs for Christmas. And I've still got that book. And dinosaurs, as every child knows, are the coolest things on the planet. And I read that book from cover to cover, and that got me interested in things like dragons. And dragons was the kind of the gateway into, all those stories, fantasy, legends, mythology, and then sort of horror, science fiction, all that. I was that kid in the library, the cliche, the classic kid, the one who doesn't play sports, the one who, doesn't get a tan because he's in the library all the time and just reading. That was me. I sort of read through my childhood. And then many years later, as an adult, I was living in Scotland. I was really interested in this kind of thing. And I was looking for a guide to the weird in the area where I was living. And there wasn't such a thing. So I thought, well, I have to write it. And that's basically started it. That's how I started. I started writing a book for myself, so to help other people understand the sort of the weird and the mythological and the folkloric in the area where I lived. And I just went around in lots of different other parts of Scotland. That's how it all started. So books are dangerous things. You should keep them in the hands of children.
Yeah, keep them out. So what are you working on now?
Well, these days I've got sort of two areas. One in terms of the books I've been commissioned for a lot of books on the bloody history of Britain. So there's lots of unpleasantness about from the history of Britain. Murders and executions and trials and torture and wars and battles and all that sort of stuff. But I'm moving more into screenwriting. So I've got my first film is going into production later this year. It's called Zombie Patrol. Can you guess what it's about?
Zombies.
Yeah. So I'm, all that sort of background that I've got is now sort of been thrust into screenwriting. So Zombie Patrol is going to go into filming. It's going to be filmed in Ohio later this year, and I've just been hired to write a script for a supernatural thriller in the UK. So that's the kind of things that I'm doing now.
Zombies and that whole thing, the whole obsession right now. Do you think that's just sort of society sort of thinking we're doomed?
No, I think it's a way of internalizing something that we all think and fear but don't really want to voice. And in the sort of a horror genre, however scary vampires and werewolves and their ilk are, you and I both know that when we walk home tonight, we're not going to be attacked by a vampire or a zombie, a vampire or a werewolf. That's just not going to happen because they are fictional entities. But it is possible that we might be attacked by the most dangerous thing on the planet, human beings. Human beings are bad news. They're dangerous, they're nasty, they're irrational, they commit crimes for poor reasons, for no reasons at all. And we're kind of scared of, violence and criminals. Zombies are human beings without any rationality. They're just beings of appetite. They're just creatures who want to kill and eat. And it says they are our bestial selves. They are the mugger and the rioter and the home invader turned into something that we can be entertained by. I think that's one of the reasons why zombies are so popular. Is simply they are us. We are scared of us. But this is it's a way that we can deal with that fear.
I agree, actually, now that you say that. It's almost like us without a soul.
Yes, that's right. And, many crimes are committed are horrible and are senseless. And they seem to be committed by people who seem to be almost inhuman, in as much as, they don't seem to have the empathy for others that, you and I and everyone we know and love has, in sort of normal life. And zombies clearly have no empathy. They're just creatures of appetite. Zombies are scary because they're us.
Yeah. Politicians.
Yeah. Lawyers.
Yeah. And okay, so what's your contact information for everybody?
My website is www.geoffholder.com. Geoff as GEOFFHOLDER.com. All my books are on there. All the stuff about my screenwriting is on there. If any of your listeners are film producers with very deep pockets, I encourage them to get in touch. But you can find out all about me on the website.
Well, this has been a really interesting hour. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Well, Alan, my pleasure.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
I'll be back.